Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, and I'm so grateful to all of you for showing up to celebrate women and the Constitution. This is the beginning of our fall season, or rather our spring season, and it's wonderful to see friends new and old, so I think we better inspire ourselves for the conversation ahead by reciting our important congressional mission. And we have some honored guests who will be hearing it for the first time. So friends, here we go. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful, what a wonderful, what a wonderful ringing recitation of the mandate. These are anxious times on all fronts. We're so grateful to you for coming. We're praying for the safety of all around the country and around the world in the face of the health challenges that beset us. And it's especially meaningful to be able to celebrate the topic of women and the Constitution. We have a wonderful program. We're going to begin with a conversation with my esteemed colleague, Elena Popchock, who has led the design of the exciting new exhibit, The 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Right to Vote. In June, we'll open this great new exhibit, which will tell the important story of how the promise of the Declaration of Independence was extended to women in the 19th Amendment and how this story carries through to today. And I can't wait to share highlights from the story that we're trying to tell with Elena. And then I will introduce our great colleague, Lauren Leader from All In Together, and she will tell you about her wonderful mission and then introduce an extremely distinguished group of public officials to talk about women in the Constitution. So, Elena, first of all, thank you so much to you and your team for assembling this exhibit. You just shared the script with me, which I was so thrilled to get, and was so struck by the idea of the Declaration of Independence as a through theme. And you quote the Declaration of Sentiments of 1848 at Seneca Falls. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. You discuss how the abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention to discuss women's issues. They prepared this manifesto, which basically rewrote the Declaration of Independence. It was signed by 68 women and 32 men. Tell us about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and what they were trying to achieve with the Declaration of Sentiments.
So it's such an interesting period in our history when you're seeing the Declaration taken and being revised in 1848. So where Elizabeth Cady Stanton literally inserts the word "and women are created equal." She was really envisioning this country fulfilling that promise that's in the Declaration. And I love reading quotes from the time convention proceedings and seeing how they're using the Declaration to really advance their argument. Stanton decides that part of the Declaration of Sentiments, she's going to include grievances against men instead of grievances against the king. So literally taking the structure of the Declaration and turning it into their purposes. So
Can I ask, what were some of those grievances?
Primarily a lot about marriage, that women being held in a form of bondage through marriage. That argument certainly continues through the 13th Amendment, that people considering abolishing slavery as marriage as a form of slavery, which is interesting. And ultimately with the 15th Amendment focused on voting rights for African American men, it's also in connection with race, it's a previous condition of servitude. Well, if you think marriage is a previous condition of servitude, maybe you actually have the right to vote.
Wow. And this was not at all fanciful given legal disabilities like the Married Women Property Acts at the time, which essentially treated married women as the legal subjects of their husbands.
Yes, and one of the grievances that she outlines in the Declaration of Sentiments, she says that women are civilly and politically dead, that they could not inherit property, They, in some ways, didn't have any rights to their own children, which is crazy to think about. So what they're fighting for in 1848, which is where really when the exhibit picks up, for obvious reasons, the Seneca Falls Convention, but they're fighting for a whole host of rights. So taking yourself back to that time, it wasn't just about the vote. It was about so much more, these rights that we hold so dear now, and we can't imagine a time where that wasn't the situation. But voting was really lower down on that priority, and it was pretty controversial at the time. Lucretia Mott did not want it to be included as part of the Declaration of Sentiments, but Stanton really pushed for it, and it ended up being approved in the final declaration when it was signed. So it was one of those resolutions, and then we know how the story goes, that voting rights is really what they end up pushing for, particularly after the Civil War.
Tell us about Stanton. What was she like? What was her career like? And what kind of copy of the Declaration of Sentiments are we going to display?
We'll start with the artifact. So we are featuring one of, there's only 12 copies of the Declaration of Sentiments left. So they're very, very rare. So we'll have a private collection that we'll be featuring that copy, and it's very small. So for an artifact of such magnitude, we try to have a better presence for it in the exhibit because it is so significant, but it's surprisingly small and rare. But Stanton herself is a very interesting figure because, like our founding fathers, there's really this mythic status about her and Susan B. Anthony. So in the exhibit, we try to kind of pull back that veil, and with all the people that we're featuring in the exhibit, is really show everything about them that we can, because we're all complex beings, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, certainly being a part of the anti-slavery movement, we see her activism all the way leading up to the Civil War, but then there's a major split in the women's suffrage movement over race in particular, and whether they would support the 15th Amendment, which would prioritize voting rights for African American men. Stanton and Anthony refused to pursue that, and they felt it was a matter of expediency and that they would push, if it didn't include women's suffrage, then they wouldn't support it. So she's very complex in trying to mediate that. I'm going to push for the abolition of slavery. I'm going to be a huge force in that movement. But then ultimately there's a split and it's over race. So how do you mediate that? She's quite a complex figure.
That's a remarkable split between the women's movement and the movement for African American suffrage. You tell in the exhibit the story about how the word male is inserted in the Constitution for the first time in the 14th Amendment, which says that if Southern states deny the right to vote to African American men, then the proportion of male citizens shall be reduced for purposes of congressional apportionment. In other words, the Reconstruction Republicans don't want the Southern states to deny African Americans the right to vote, but allow them to get the benefit of that in apportionment. So they insert this word male, and that's one of the factors that leads Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony to break with the abolitionists. So that goes so far as leading them to not support the 15th Amendment. Tell us about that further split and how some women suffrage advocates actually tacitly accepted the rise of Jim Crow.
Yeah, so the two organizations end up splitting from this and pursuing different tactics. It's one, supporting the 15th Amendment, as at least that's progress. So women like Lucy Stone are in that camp. Frederick Douglass supports that. And then on the other side, you have Stanton and Anthony pursuing this other tactic that we are only going to accept a national amendment that includes women. So that split ends up fracturing the movement for decades. They're pursuing different tracks, and then ultimately they realized we should really come back together. We're supporting the same cause. So way after Reconstruction, they merged together and pretty much stays through the rest of the story through 1920, that organization. But It's a really complicated story to tell around race, because what you ultimately discover is the traditional narrative that we're taught about the lead up to the 19th Amendment is really from the white women's mainstream suffrage organizations. So when you try to tell that more complex narrative, it gets challenging. And we just opened our exhibit about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and we're addressing slavery and issues of race through Reconstruction. So we were certainly primed to address these topics and really unpack how racism really hurt the movement in many ways, and African American women were largely left out of the mainstream movement, and also by the end, with the 19th Amendment, there were still millions of women of color who were not able to vote because the same tactics, the same Jim Crow tactics of literacy tests, poll taxes were then being used, the same purpose against women of color.
Well, it's so important to tell that constitutional story with all of its strands and with its discomforting as well as inspiring moments. You then take the story through to the 1870s, and the first drafts of the 19th Amendment begin to be introduced, and we're creating an exciting new interactive, which you can access in the gallery and also online, where you can see the earliest drafts of the 19th Amendment, what became the 19th Amendment, and compare the text. Tell us what some of those early drafts were and who was proposing it.
Yeah, so it's traditionally 1878 is looked at as the first true, what we view as the 19th Amendment, when that was first proposed in Congress. It kept being proposed in Congress every year, pretty much until the 19th Amendment ultimately passed in 1919. But before that, it's interesting, there's a flurry during Reconstruction when they're debating the 14th and 15th Amendments and what they will encompass. They start passing along universal suffrage resolutions. So they're advancing this broader picture that everybody will be able to vote, and it will be tied to citizenship. So there's a couple drafts that when you look at them, you think, oh yeah, well, women would have been included in that, but explicitly, as it relates to gender, 1878 was the first draft. So we're preparing this interactive called the drafting table, so it will be in the exhibit and online. That will have all of those drafts laid out, as well as all the influencing events, documents that really help us get to 1920 and understand why we ended up with the 19th.
Wow. At the same time as the amendment was being proposed, there was an effort to fight for women's suffrage in the courts. And you tell the really riveting story about how some women, like Victoria Woodhull and others, argued before John Bingham, who wrote the 14th Amendment, you must read women into the promises of the 14th Amendment, and then the Supreme Court repeatedly rejects those challenges in Minor and Happerstat, holding that the right to vote is not a privilege or immunity of citizenship, and the Bradwell case infamously holding that women were created by God, essentially, to be homemakers rather than equal citizens, and therefore they could not have equal rights. Tell us about some of those cases and how we're going to bring those to life.
Yeah, so one of the tactics used during Reconstruction after the 14th Amendment in particular was ratified, they tried to get women to the polls, saying, you're actually covered under this. We believe that the 14th Amendment says that you are a citizen, therefore citizens have voting rights. That's how they were reading it. So as Jeff's saying, leading to certain Supreme Court cases where that was addressed, and ultimately those claims were determined to not be true. But women were going to the polls and voting, and one of those women was Carrie Burnham from here in Philadelphia. She went to an election, I believe it was 1872. She tried to vote, and she believed that the 14th Amendment gave her that right. She ended up taking it to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it was their decision ultimately was a precedent that was set when the Supreme Court decided 1875 Minor v. Happerstat that no, the 14th Amendment does not, citizenship does not confer voting rights under the 14th Amendment. So it's cool to have that local angle. Every time I can, I try to bring in Philadelphia-specific stories to feature in the exhibit. So it's great that it started here and then moved to the national level.
Then in the 1870s and 80s, more and more states begin to recognize the right to vote for women. Tell us some of that story. including there were some states at the founding era that recognized voting, surprisingly, but a surprising number really picked up in the 1870s and 80s. What happened there?
So at the nation's founding, it was primarily in New Jersey that women were actually able to vote, and it wasn't all, because it was primarily widows who could own property because they were unmarried. So it was a small set of women, but they found records recently that confirmed that women did actually go to the polls and voted under the New Jersey State Constitution of 1776. And then ultimately, through the Jacksonian era, a lot of those property qualifications, states started looking at their constitutions and pulling back from that language that could be read as allowing women to vote. So ultimately, 1807, they take away that in their New Jersey State Constitution by rewriting it. And then we move many years forward to the 1869, I think, is the first state that ultimately granted women full voting rights, and it's Wyoming in the West, because primarily in the West, as the territories were being settled, they wanted women to settle in the states, in the territories, so they could ultimately have enough of a population. It was very practical they wanted to attract women to their borders, and then they could apply for statehood with enough of a population. So that starts happening in the 1860s, and then as the movement's gaining traction at the state level, they're realizing, okay, maybe we're not going to push for a constitutional amendment, we're going to push for change at the state level, which might then ultimately spark a national change. So we have an interactive that we're developing for the exhibit that you'll be able to interact with each state and see what was happening at that level as women were trying to get the right to vote in their individual states.
And now finally we're at the moment of the 19th Amendment itself. What was it that tipped the political scales in favor of the national amendment, and then tell the incredibly dramatic story of how it was ratified state by state, eventually endorsed by President Wilson, and then ratified by a single vote in a single state?
So in the last few years of the movement, there's a lot of militant suffrage activism, as it was called at the time, with the National Woman's Party. They are really your traditional imagery that you see of women picketing outside the White House and organizing parades, really taking it to the streets and making it very apparent that they definitely wanted the vote. So there were a lot of activism in the streets that was pushing for change, and then World War I had a huge impact, particularly in relation with Woodrow Wilson finally saying he did believe we should have a national amendment, and he encouraged the Senate in particular to pass it because he had seen all the sacrifices that women made in the war, in serving in various capacities, not only at the home front, but also abroad. So a lot of that altogether really changed public sentiments and ultimately the president's mind. So 1919, it passes Congress. Of course, then it gets sent to the states to ratify. There's a flurry of states at the beginning who ratify right away, and then it gets drawn out. And they're pinning all their hopes on Delaware. Delaware does not ratify it, so then they have another state they're looking towards is Tennessee. And they didn't really think they had much of a chance, and everything seemed as though the state legislature was going to vote no. But the youngest member of the legislature, Harry T. Byrne, received a note from his mother saying that you should definitely vote yes for this amendment. And she signed it with lots of love, Mama. And what did he do? He changed his vote, and that ultimately meant that it passed, but that it also was ratified because that was the final state needed to push it over the edge. So it's really amazing that letter exists. We will have a picture of it in the exhibit. It's in Knox County, Tennessee, has the original letter, but it's one of those stories you kind of can't believe that it's true and that it was one vote that pushed it over the edge.
It's an amazing story. It's inspiring constitutional drama, and it reminds us always to listen to Mom. The Equal Rights Amendment is proposed soon after the 19th Amendment is passed. We have some texts of the early drafts of the Equal Rights Amendment. What was the relation between the passage of the 19th and the effort to extend it beyond voting rights to equal rights of citizenship in general? And tell us about some of that early debate.
There were a lot of suffragists who turned their attention immediately after the 19th Amendment as this is great progress, but it needs to go farther. The primary person being Alice Paul from New Jersey. She ended up drafting the ERA and seeing that the 19th Amendment not really conveying any type of gender equality. It was one part of that, but they needed more. So she ended up drafting it, first proposed it in Congress in 1923. And it's interesting that at the time it was proposed, it definitely split the women who had been fighting for women's suffrage, so now more of like a first wave feminism movement at this point, because they're no longer fighting for suffrage, you had people who were pushing for legislation that would give women special treatment because of their gender. So if the ERA were to be passed, in their minds, they were thinking, well, that means that all of that work would be undone. So they believed that in some ways women should have that special treatment, not just equal treatment across the board. So it ended up splitting a lot of the women who were fighting for various things after the 19th Amendment, because there were a lot who were trying to legislate to protect women in the workforce, to protect infants, and all these factors believed that Alice Paul just still felt that the ERA was the way to go, so she fought that until her dying day. It didn't have much support. Ultimately, in the 70s, it got resurrected, interestingly, because it was the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So now we're at the 100th. So there was a revival in the ERA. There's a revival in the ERA now. History certainly repeats itself, but it's just, we're going to try to present all the questions that we can that are surrounding it right now, because it's a very live issue, but we know that you guys are going to come here to the Constitution Center and seek out that information. So we'll be providing it in this exhibit.
Well, I can't wait to hear how you're going to provide it, because I saw the script and it's phenomenal, but there's a kind of ending TK aspect to it, as the journalists say, ending to come, because right now the status of the 19th Amendment is being vigorously debated, and we just did a great podcast. On one side, there's the claim that because Virginia ratified, then the necessary 8 states have been reached, and therefore the amendment should be certified by the archivist. The argument on the other side is that 4 states have rescinded their ratifications, and the deadline passed. Several of the ratifications took place after the deadline that Congress mandated, and therefore Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has recently suggested it would be best to start over and to ratify everything again to make sure that its ratification is as sound as possible. So, Elena, how are we going to convey all this at the end of the exhibit, or at least when will I see the next draft?
Well, we're certainly working on it, because we do have to open June 10th. But I know that that's certainly a spot that we may have to update. So I want to build in enough wiggle room that, if we have to print a new graphic, we are able to. So there may just be more to come.
That sounds great. We'll close by asking you, what are some of the other artifacts in the exhibit that you're most excited about displaying?
So when we were talking about during Reconstruction, when women were able to vote in some states, or they tried to vote in other states, we actually have a ballot box from the early 1870s, and it's very large, and I'm told that it is a mule-mounted ballot box that would go from polling place to polling place, because it has little curved feet on the bottom, because it's actually a round drum. So it collected women's votes at that time, which it literally says women's ballots on the front of it. So that's one of my personal favorites. We have a lot of the really cool artifacts from the time, as you can imagine, the very colorful, fun sayings from the movement as they're trying to convince everyone that they should have the right to vote. And there's a lot of fun imagery around that. You see a lot of rolling pins, flowers, pans, everything you can imagine. But my personal favorite is definitely a button that has a little pair of velvet pants attached to it that says, "Who shall wear them, you or I?"
Wonderful.
So I promise there's a lot of fun ones like that.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can tell from the enthusiasm, the passion, and the intellectual rigor of Elena Popchock how lucky I am to work with her and her great team. Please join me in thanking Elena Popchock.
Thank you.
And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Lauren Leader. She is co-founder and CEO of All In Together. She's dedicated her life and career to advancing women and business. Her first book was Crossing the Thinnest Line, which debuted in the top 50 on Amazon. She is a frequent speaker, commentator, and advocate for women's equality, and she will tell us about the crucially important mission of All In Together, and then we'll introduce and moderate our next panel. Please join me in welcoming Lauren Leader.
Wait, we're doing,
absolutely.
We're doing these. Okay.
No question.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Elena. It's such a joy to be here at the Constitution Center. And Jeff and I started thinking about this event a number of months ago. Obviously, we did not anticipate some of the world events that would be happening. So we wanted to thank all of you for being here. I know it's been a strange week, and we're so thrilled that so many of our speakers came. Unfortunately, some of them could not for some of the reasons that have been in the news, including Margaret Hoover, my dear friend and colleague. So I will be standing in for her for our amazing panel. But I did want to just take a minute to talk about the work that we're doing at All In Together, because it connects so deeply to really where are we as a country 100 years after suffrage. All In Together was founded 5 years ago as one of the only nonpartisan, and truly strictly so, nonpartisan women's civic education organizations in the United States. And we train women up and down the economic and political spectrum all over America on the basics of political participation. It turns out that one of the realities that keeps women on the sidelines of our political process today is that they feel overwhelmingly that they lack the knowledge and the insights that they need in order to fully participate. We have a civics crisis in the United States. Most Americans couldn't answer the questions on our citizenship test. 70% of Americans can't name a single person who represents them in elected office. And so in that context, women, 100 years after getting the right to vote, are outvoting men and have done so in every election since 1980. They are the majority of the electorate. And in fact, black women, who I think are finally starting to get their due in the public discourse, especially since our recent primaries in South Carolina, are the most likely to be registered to vote and the most likely to turn out at the polls of any group of Americans. And so women have enormous power and influence in our political process, and yet there remain enormous gaps to their full and equal participation in the American political process and in American society. So I said that we outvote men, and that has been true since 1980. And yet in many other measures of political engagement and participation, women are still behind. They are less likely to lobby their representatives, less likely to make phone calls or send letters or lobby in person to their elected representatives. And they are less likely to see the political process as a way to make the country better. 100 years after suffrage, women are still much more likely to volunteer for nonprofit organizations, for school boards and community organizations than they are to participate fully in our political process. Our mission at All In Together is to help close those education gaps, to help women get the tools and resources they need to be full advocates, full citizens, full participants in our democracy, and that mission remains critically true today. We obviously are all cognizant of the incredible gains that women made in the 116th Congress through the midterm elections in 2018. And it is indeed a moment of great celebration to see this record number of women that have been elected to the highest offices, not just to congressional and the Senate offices, but also in state houses across the country. Our previous speakers mentioned Virginia and the ratification of the ERA in the state of Virginia. That was possible because women not only gained significant seats in the 2018 midterms in the Virginia legislature, but for the first time, a woman, a Jewish woman, is now the Speaker of the Virginia state legislature. And yet, there are still very few states where women are even at parity in terms of representation. Nevada is at nearly 50% in the state legislature. Guam is at 50%. And yet, across the country, in most states, we are still not above 30% representation. And yes, even with this historic number of women elected to 116th Congress, we are barely at 30%. Today, there remain only 13 Republican women left in the House of Representatives. So when you look around the landscape, there is much to celebrate. There is tremendous work that remains to be done. The World Economic Forum ranks the United States 96th in the world for the political parity of women. 96th. When we found it all in together in 2015, the United States was at 54th. We have dropped to 96th in those years. That is, of course, partially because we remain one of the few countries, and there are 59 other nations that have elected women heads of state ahead of our nation, and we, of course, have not, and apparently will not be doing so in this cycle either. But in addition, we now today have the lowest number of women in the presidential cabinet that we've had in 40 years. And so for every step that we make forward, for all the great strides that there are to celebrate, we remain still so far behind so much of the world in terms of that full representation of women, the full vision that the suffragists had 100 years ago when they ratified the 19th Amendment. There's more work to do. And lastly, before I welcome up our amazing panel, who are really an incredible representation of the great successes of women's suffrage, the great successes of the women's movement over these last 100 years, and hopefully for 100 more years to come, it's worth it to put it in context as well. How are women doing overall in the United States today? Well, unfortunately, not as well as many other nations when it comes to political parity. There's much to celebrate. Women are now 50% of the workforce. They are a majority of the primary breadwinners in American society. They are the majority of the college degree earners across almost every field and discipline, with a few small exceptions like computer science and engineering. They are the majority of the life sciences degrees, the law degrees, the advanced degrees, extraordinary achievement. And yet also, women remain the majority of Americans in poverty. 70% of Americans in poverty are women and children. The vast majority of minimum wage earners in the United States are women. And so when you look at the landscape of how well we have done, how far we have come, it's also important to recognize how much more work there is to do for women to become full and equal members of American society, and how much harder we have to work to get to parity. It's a sobering and also inspiring and motivating moment, I think, for so many of us who spend our lives working on these issues. But it's an important time for all of us to continue to step up and lead and find those opportunities. So with that, I would like to welcome up our extraordinary panel. I think we are missing a chair, a couple, so we'll let them slide that on. But with that, I would like to welcome, should I give you a second? Yeah. Our amazing panel. First of all, Congresswoman Donna Edwards from Maryland's 4th District, who many of you also know from her many appearances on MSNBC, on CNN, on ABC, bringing her brilliance to the airwaves. She was in Congress from 2008 to 2017. She was also the first director of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. I spoke about the sort of ups and downs of how Americans are doing. There's no other measure, in some ways it's more sobering, than the statistics on the numbers of women who still experience domestic violence in this country. 1 in 3 American women, 1 in 3, are victims of domestic violence. It speaks to, again, how far we have to go. But Donna Edwards has been a champion for those issues. Please join me in welcoming Donna to whatever coastal seat. Please also join me in welcoming former Congresswoman Melissa Hart from Pennsylvania's 4th District. in Pittsburgh, right, just outside of Pittsburgh. She was the first Republican woman elected to the state Senate in Pennsylvania when she was 28 years old. So take that, AOC. She currently runs a political media strategy organization. We're so thrilled to have you. Come sit. We're doing this on a rolling basis. And then I take special pleasure, please come sit. I take special pleasure in welcoming my dear friend and also official mentor, which I'll say a word about, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul from the great state of New York, my home state, who is also now the chair of the Women's Suffrage Commission for the state of New York, which we're so excited about. And she is also, in addition to her role as Lieutenant Governor, is a former member of Congress herself. So we're very lucky that we have so much of Congress represented. And just a word about Kathy as she's coming up. This past year, I decided to put my own money where my mouth was, or time where my mouth was, and I ran for office in Westchester County in New York. I won, and I won not in small part to the amazing mentorship of the Lieutenant Governor, who called me constantly, haranguing me to make sure I was not screwing up, which was very helpful and truly amazing, and I'm so grateful for it. But she has been an incredible advocate for women in the state of New York and beyond, and we're so lucky to have all of you, so please join me in welcoming our amazing panel. We are also, so I'm going to chat with these amazing women for a little while, and I also just wanted to welcome our folks who I hope have now joined us on the live stream. There were some technical challenges, but I hope they're with us now. We're going to chat, and then I think we are going to hopefully have time for a couple questions towards the end, so get them ready. We'd love to hear from you. So welcome, ladies. Happy 100th anniversary of suffrage. It's exciting. So as I started to say, I mean, it has obviously been an amazing couple years in terms of the progress of women in elections. Lots of incredible gains in terms of the overall numbers. Obviously, as we'll talk about, a decline in the number of Republican women, so it is not equally balanced on both sides of the aisle. But as you think about this legacy of 100 years and how far we've come, how do you think about what these years to come really need to be in terms of, you know, both women's political power, but women's power overall in American society? And I don't know, should we start with you, Kathy?
Well, we think about the next 100 years, they've already started.
Yeah.
I live every single day with that sense of urgency that time is slipping away. And I hearken the ghosts of the suffragettes. We are the home of the Seneca Falls, the start of the women's rights movement. I've been there. It's like going to Mecca. I've been there many times to pay homage to their stories, but also put upon my own shoulders and the shoulders of women I speak to on a daily basis, the burden that they have passed on to us with that torch. That torch is in our hands today. And while we won the right to vote 100 years ago, that right to vote did not mean equality. And that is the battle that we struggle with today. The numbers you gave on the number of women participating in the workforce and being college educated, those are phenomenal. But they're in the workforce, but they're not the CEOs. They're graduating with advanced degrees, but they're only 20% of college presidents are women. Mm-hmm. Only 20% of school superintendents are women, even though the majority of people start on the path are women in education. So we seem to have hit this glass ceiling of 20%, 23% of Congress, and you know, New York, progressive state, 33%. So I wear my glass ceiling necklace here to remind me. And I wore it this morning when I spoke to a large gathering of steelworkers in Albany before I came here. And there were just a few women in the room. And I was so excited because afterward, the 3 women in the room came up to me and said, we have the same necklace on. And so it's a constant reminder that that 20% needs to turn to 50%. We have to fight every single day to get more representation in the corridors of power, to continue the work that you do with All In Together, because you don't just talk about equality and opportunity in the political process, but throughout society. And so I take this very seriously. We have a long way to go to give more women rights in so many areas, freedom from sexual harassment in the workplace, adequate child care. We can talk a whole forum on how that is a barrier for so many women running for office, and women who want to become a partner in a law firm, who's going to watch the kids, or a woman who has to go to community college while she's working as a waitress and also working in a hotel. So there's who's watching the kids. That hasn't changed. I mean, still the weight is on women, and I think that's one of the big barriers that's holding them back.
Donna, I know you obviously have spent so much of your career thinking about these issues, and over to you.
Well, it's wonderful to listen to my former colleague, now Lieutenant Governor. It's great to be here with you all. I think about, as you were talking, I listened to your remarks about African American women and, sort of the backbone of our political participation. And I thought about women in Congress. There have only been 57 African American women who've ever served in the Congress, and all of them served in my lifetime. The first elected, Shirley Chisholm in 1968, sworn in 1969. In my lifetime, and that's the bulk of African American women's participation in the Congress at the highest levels. And I think about, for women, as much as we celebrate, we had a Year of the Woman in 1992, and then we got another year in 2018, and still we're at about 23%. It's exciting on one hand, but it's very sobering on the other that progress is really slow. And our political participation is so connected to our economic participation, to our participation in education. And it makes me wonder what it will take to get over that 50% threshold. And this story of women's participation is also about men. And it's about men who are in power, who have to give up the reins of that power in order to enable there to be space for women to recognize our fullest participation. On the other hand, I'm heartened. I'm the mom of a 30-year-old and a young man.
What? How's that
Yes.
possible?
And,
Okay.
And you know what? His view about women and women's capacity and participation is actually very different from men of my generation. And so it's a reminder, I think, to all of us that change is possible, even if it's slow.
Yeah. So, Melissa, you were so young when you won elected office with her, son 28. It's amazing. So now as you think about these last years since that first race, like, how do you think about these issues? What's changed? What needs to change? What you hope to see?
Yeah, I come at it from a different perspective. I think the Year of the Woman was 1990 because that's when I, as a very young attorney, decided that I should run against an incumbent state senator. And my party even said to me, no, you can't run for that. Why don't you just run for the House? And I'm like, but the Senate district is better. I think I have more of a shot at that. And I had been a volunteer, and I think a lot of us kind of grew up working on campaigns. We were comfortable with the give and take. I'm an undergraduate from Washington and Jefferson College, where I had the great opportunity to take history from one of the just legends, I think, of our college, a gentleman who was a journalist, and he was very, very liberal, and I'm a Republican, and I'm a conservative. But he recognized something in me and challenged me daily in his class by making a point that he suspected I might disagree with. And he helped me hone my debate skills. And it's not just that you agree or disagree, but that you have the depth of knowledge and understanding of your issue to be able to explain it to people, to win your argument. As a lawyer, you are taught that as well. But I think in the political sphere, you need to do it in a way that brings people in. You don't have to worry, or you have to worry more about the way you're being perceived by the public, not being concerned about some intellectual argument for a judge. So he taught me those things, and it was very helpful. And I think mentors of all kinds are extremely important. I had a mentor when I decided to actually get involved as a grassroots committee woman. Right after law school, there was a woman who was a state representative where I was. And again, she was a Republican from my community, and she didn't want to run for the seat because I called her and I said, some people have suggested I should run for the state Senate seat. I was 27 years old. And when I called her, she didn't laugh. She said, that's great. She says, I don't want to run for that. She still had kids at home. She didn't want the bigger district. She was, making one of those decisions. And she said, but I'll help you.
Oh, wow.
And so that kind of background, I think it's really important, I think, for people just to understand that they can do it. And that with the help around you, and it doesn't always have to be women. Like I mentioned, my professor was a guy, and one of my best mentors in my early political career was a guy named Dick Thornburg, who at the time I met him was the governor of Pennsylvania from, out in Pittsburgh. So I think for us, that's important for us to seek that. You don't necessarily have to grow up like we did, always working on campaigns. I think if you're a person who comes to a passion about certain issues that may be before your local government or your state legislature or your United States Congress, that you can get involved. It doesn't matter. You can be older, you can be younger. You don't have to be anything in particular other than an American citizen.
Yeah.
And it's important that I think everyone look at that as it's a participatory government. That means we all have to participate, whether we are running, helping someone, voting, but paying attention to those issues and getting that depth of knowledge that I think is so important. You hear a lot of the debate now that is just it's about as deep as a puddle. And when people get into the discussions back and forth, it becomes sort of an exchange of anger or just simple points that really don't make a whole lot of sense. It's important for each and every one of us who engage in the process to have value and depth to our arguments and an understanding of history, which I think is unfortunately too lacking these days. So I would encourage really everyone and anybody who's watching us too and not here, that it really is for everyone. When the Founding Fathers were drawing up our form of government, they expected people to leave their profession, serve, and then go back home.
Since we're in the Constitution Center, I have to do this.
So that's what I did.
Jeff will correct me if I'm wrong, but most Americans don't realize, we think of the First Amendment, of course, as the right to free speech, but also enshrined in the First Amendment is the right to petition our grievances. Yeah. And I think part of what we've found at All In Together is that in the TV age, government feels so far away, it feels so alien, so impossible to access, that when we give women even, some small access to like a local legislator or to meet, even just to meet in person a woman who has run or is in elected office or has worked on campaigns, like it's a game changer. It totally changes their sense of possibility. We've had women, we had a survivor who had been assaulted at work, who was just despaired, who came to one of our programs in Minnesota last year. She was so inspired after hearing from some of the women in our group that she went and got the law changed in Minnesota single-handedly, petitioned to change the law in Minnesota so that the reporting requirements for assault would be taken out of the chain of command in the police department where she had been, in the police. So women have such a capacity to make change, but they have to sort of see it and touch it and feel it. Donna, you mentioned, actually both you and Kathy mentioned also sort of the unfinished work. All of the things that are undone. You talked about childcare. As you all think about the years to come and all of these gaps, I find I'm so shocked that so few women see political participation as a way to fix those things. But now we're at this point where the private sector is not fixing some of those things. So as you think about the potential, as more and more women sit in elected office at the state levels, at the national levels, what do you hope we will start to see? What are the most important issues to address to continue to accelerate women's progress? Yeah, Kathy.
Well, certainly women know the challenges of running a household more than anybody. You bring your own personal experiences to the process. And we bring an empathy and understanding, and we're masterful multitaskers. I was running for office, raising little kids, studying for the Maryland Bar Association on top of my New York Bar Association, trying to keep it all together. And it was a crazy time in my life. And I have to tell you, there were some tough times, like when I was running for my first office 25 years ago, and my little girl wanted me to tuck her in before she started kindergarten. And I was out knocking on doors because I knew I had to touch every single person in my town of 50,000 running for the same position you ran for, Lauren. And this one gentleman kept me at the door. He kept talking and talking and talking. I'm like, please, it's getting darker, and I'm being far too polite, and I'm listening. By the time I pulled in the driveway, I went upstairs, and Katie had cried herself to sleep. And I wasn't there the night before she went to kindergarten because I was out campaigning. And that little girl is 30 years old. I still have mom guilt over that. But
she turned out okay.
But you know what? I think that's the message, too, for all the women. And I know there's 4 reasons women don't run for office, because I've suffered from all of them and I've overcome them, which is why I try to encourage so many women to run, but talk to me first. But the who's watching the kids question is so profound, and it's such a barrier in the sense that you're like, oh, I'll miss too many soccer games, I'll miss the teacher conference. I missed all of it. But the end of the day is, I have 2 adult children who have a strong social conscience. They are part of the marches in Washington. They're marching on climate change, they're marching on gun issues, and they're out there. They both live in Washington, D.C., where they were born when I worked for Senator Moynihan, and I'm so proud of them. And you know what? They cut me a lot of slack. I say, are you still feeling bad about that? No, Mom. And the fact that you missed my 7th birthday, I'll get over that someday. So we hold ourselves back, but sometimes you just have to power through it, because we only have these kids for 18 years. And then we launch them into the world. And my parents took me to marches in the 60s. I was there on the war issue. I was there on civil rights. My parents worked to integrate my lily white neighborhood, and we had African Americans on our front porch, and my parents were on some sort of hit list with the NRA members. I grew up in a crazy environment of social activism. I passed it on to my kids, and I hope my kids will pass it on. That's why women can't sit on the sidelines. You have this responsibility, not just to your society, but also to your kids, to be a role model on the potential and the power that we have to bring our voices to the table in full representation. And we can have loud voices at 20%. I've been the only woman in the room so many times, it's not even funny. And I've made them listen to me. But wouldn't it be awesome if I could look around the room and see so many more women and know that our voices truly matter? That's the legacy I want to uphold from the right we have to vote into today.
Well, I got to acknowledge my mom, who's here, who just reminded me that she carried petitions for when Shirley Chisholm ran for president. So my mom is here, and she is certainly a reason why. Certainly a reason why I do what I do, and worked for Bella Abzug when I was a kid. But that example of our parents and their civic engagement is everything. Donna, what's the next frontier? What do we need to do?
I don't know. I mean, I always got really, very frustrated, both as an activist and a member of Congress, when people would tell me about this narrow category of women's issues. And I thought, well, my gosh, and especially as a mom, as a single mom raising a kid, I can't actually think of a single issue, whether it's economic or domestic or, international policy, that is not a woman's issue. And I think that as elected leaders and people who want to be in the fray, it's really important to, I think, as Melissa described, develop some depth on a whole range of things so that you don't allow people to pigeonhole you. And so I think there's a lot out there. When I first ran for Congress, I decided I was going to run because there was a guy who represented us in our district, and I just thought he wasn't doing a great job, and there were a whole host of issues. And so here's what I did. I went around and asked everybody I could find who held elective office if they would run and challenge him. And mostly the people who held elective office already were men. And they all said no because they thought there was a big machine and they couldn't beat him, et cetera, et cetera. And so one day I actually got up and I was standing in front of the mirror. I hadn't managed to convince anyone. And I looked at myself, and this is after dozens of conversations, and I actually looked at myself and said, Donna, why don't you run? Well, nobody ever asked me to run, but I had to look in the mirror and ask myself. And I ran down to the Board of Elections. I paid, I think, $100. I was so grateful that check cleared. And I just became a candidate for the House of Representatives. And I came very close in that election. I didn't win. And so when I talk to women, I say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of losing, for sure. Because a lot of times you have to lose in order to win. And then I won the second time, like, overwhelmingly. And then in Congress, at one point, I decided I wanted to run for the United States Senate. And it was a total long shot. But I thought, well, there were at that time, no African-American women in the Senate.
Now there's
one.
Oh,
Again,
no.
one, so the second one. There are a lot of guys who all kind of look like each other. And why not have, another woman in the United States Senate? And it didn't work out, but I think it was important still to run. And I think that for women, we have to expand our horizons, and we can't let people tell us no and take ourselves out of the game before we actually play the game.
Yeah.
And then our to-do list can include so much more than it does now, than the bucket of things that are on the table. And then lastly, I would say, not be afraid to tell your own story about who you are and what brings you into politics. I think so often, as women, we're so guarded about the things that we can share about ourselves because we think that that's going to be, used against us. And I think it's important because people vote for real people. They vote for authentic people, and there are no better people to tell those stories than women who have
I've been saying lately,
lots of stories.
authenticity is our superpower. Really. Right. Because I think it is such a differentiator, and I think it is part of what I think also defines modern politics as opposed to even 30, 40 years ago, where I think many women really felt they had to sort of twist themselves into knots. And I think, that's the legacy of this current cycle, that even the, 4 or 5 women that ran for president in this cycle, was such a game changer, the way that all of them ran. As themselves, really, and nothing else. And I mean, even, refusing to get overly made up. And it's the little things that every single time a woman runs on either side of the aisle, every single time they run, they change it for somebody behind them. Melissa, your thoughts? I mean, one challenge, obviously, we're now really, the numbers of Republican women in the House really are now so low. It's really a shame. We have a two-party system. We got to make sure we're getting women on both sides of the aisle into the game. How have you been thinking about that issue?
Well, a lot of Republican women lost as well. So it's not like
and
Republican
retiring.
women haven't won and served, because there's been significant numbers. And in the year, in 2006 and 2008, some of the smartest, most incredible, wonderful public servants that I've ever known in my life lost their seats, and they were women.
Yep.
They were Republican women. And I think it's important, I'm sitting up here as the only Republican woman on the panel, but I'm glad I'm here, and I actually kind of felt compelled to do this because otherwise there wouldn't have been one.
And it's critical.
And I think, Donna, you really hit the nail on the head when you said every issue is a women's issue. If anyone who's a candidate, I don't care if you're a man or a woman, if you expect to be taken seriously, you better, number one, have your own mind and understand things. And number two, don't think that you have to be pigeonholed into some view because you're a woman or because you're a man. That will never be equal if every woman thinks that she has to take the same position on every issue that every other woman takes. I honestly, I had a chief of staff when I was in Congress. He was also with me when I was in the Senate for a few years. And he used to use a term. He'd say, "That's reductive." And I said, "Is that really a word?" And then I thought about it and the meaning of it, and that is exactly what it is. Because what we do to ourselves, if we allow that, we all have to qualify for Emily's list. Well, I'm pro-life. I'm Catholic. My district was pro-life. I'm not going to apply to Emily's list for money. I mean, that would be backwards. I'm going to go to the Susan B. Anthony list because they support pro-life women and pro-life candidates. We should be who we are. We should think for ourselves. Otherwise, I personally don't think that women will ever be equal if we all think we all have to be the same. So that having been said, one of the things that your first question was, what do we need to do to move forward? We need to just be the best candidate who also happens to be a woman. Be the best. Like Melania says, be best. And if you're a woman, do it. And I think, to be honest, we're talking about kids. I have 3 nieces, a goddaughter, all in college now. Their views on politics vary. One of them goes to a fairly, I would consider it a fairly liberal arts college in Ohio. Very good school, Denison. And some of you may be familiar with it. She chose to write a letter to the editor. She's studying economics and trade. She's really interested in those things. She has come down on the side of being somewhat conservative, and she's very interested in some of the things that are happening now on the national level. So she wrote an op-ed for the newspaper. At first, she was afraid to submit it because it was somewhat pro-Trump and some of the agenda that he's pursued now, trying to force some of our trading partners into being more even with us. And so she submitted it, and she came home for like Thanksgiving or something after she submitted it, and she said, I can't believe it. I got yelled at by a lot of students because I submitted that. She said, but more came up to me and said, wow, that's great because you're working on the economy for us. When we get out of school, we're going to be more likely to get jobs if our trade is more fair because there'll be more growth here. So she decided to be who she is, step out as who she is. Of course, I was teasing her about running for office. She's 21. And, but I think it's important that the fear and some of the, what's going on in academia now where, you know, a speaker comes onto campus and gets shouted down, we need to teach our young people that that is just wrong. We need to stop that. You need to open your ears and close your mouth and learn and understand and articulate your differences with each other in a civil way. Because if we don't teach them that now, we're not going to see that in the future. And I think women can lead the way in that gentility because we actually, I think, have a better way of expressing ourselves in a lot of ways than men do.
Well,
and I think that's one of the things we can do to change.
I mean, I think I think you make some really important points about, look, we're as diverse as the nation. We are as diverse as the nation, period. We do not all agree. We will not all agree. And the expectation that we should all agree is unrealistic.
It is.
And yet we continue to be treated, and I think reductive is the right word, that in so much of the narrative about women, and especially women in politics, it's this sort of tacit expectation that if you don't all agree, then you're just not being supportive. And that is very reductive. It dismisses the diversity of perspective that women bring. I wanted to just bring back for 1 minute before we open it up for questions for our last few minutes, to just talk a little bit more about where we want to go. So if we recognize that all issues are women's issues, and yet also there are some issues particular to women that remain unsolved, violence against women, the numbers of women in low-wage work, the lack of infrastructure for working mothers, and that is true for working parents, but the burden still falls disproportionately on women. The lack of progress into leadership, as you pointed out, not just in politics, but in so many arenas. As you think about public policy, I mean, Jeff spoke about the ERA. What are some of the things that you really, I don't know if that's, it's still controversial about whether or not that will solve the problems that people are looking for, but what are your sense of, like, what are some of the most, pressing, urgent areas that we must focus on if we want to accelerate progress, get us off, up that list of the global nations that achieve gender equity. By the way, the number one on the list, extra brownie points for anyone who can tell me, and not my team, who knows what the number one most gender equal nation on earth is according to the World Economic Forum? No. It is Iceland. It has been Iceland for many years. It is Iceland. Iceland women worked their butts off for that, by the way. No one handed it to them. So anyway, yes, Kathy, your thoughts.
I think about issues, and since I ran for town board, I've never liked the phrase women issues either.
Yeah.
I've never used this because every issue is something we care about. But I think what we need to lean hard into are the bread and butter table issues. I mean, with the kitchen table issues. Parents today are overly stressed out about whether or not they're going to go into debt trying to help their kids pay for college, and if they don't go into debt, then their kids are going to go into debt. I mean, the cost of college is terrifying to families. But also, once they get that education, are they going to have the skills that our society and the jobs that are looking for? I mean, are they going to be trained properly? Minimum wage, there should be a higher minimum wage. We have a $15 minimum wage in the state of New York. We lift so many people out of poverty by that one move, and the majority of whom are women. Paid family leave, we have the most generous paid family leave program in America in the state of New York, allowing people to be able to bond with their new babies or adopted child, or at the other end of life spectrum, to not worry about losing your job if you want to hold your mother's hand as she takes her last breath, as I was able to do when my mom was fighting ALS. These are human issues. They're not women's issues, they're just human rights issues. And we need to talk about them in a way that other people can connect with. Education, healthcare, the fear of communities that don't have proper health insurance, when they know it's the young people or the people with minimum wage jobs who don't have paid leave, when they're sick. They're going to keep showing up to work. They may be exposed to an illness that's going to contaminate their community. That's what we're facing now because we don't have health care for everyone. We have 95% of people in New York covered, but the rest of the nation is nowhere near our numbers. So these are issues we lean hard into, but I will tell you one thing, what makes me optimistic. I have seen women govern so differently than men.
I was hoping
And
you'd say that.
we have opportunities to be so much more collaborative. Donna and I went on a trip to Afghanistan. I was a member of the Armed Services Committee. We had a bipartisan plane of women who had been elected as part of the Tea Party. And then you get a woman from Maryland and New York. I have to tell you, at the end of that trip, we were best friends. Yeah. We had shared stories of what it's like to climb your way to the top when the institution, all the men say, you're not going to be able to make it, we're not going to be there for you, and they did it anyhow. I gravitate to strong women, women who are risk takers, like Donna running for Senate when people told her she wouldn't make it. I was told, don't even run for Congress. Your own party won't support you because you're going to get blown away in the most Republican district in the state of New York as a Democrat. But I ran out there because I believed that if I talked about issues, Medicare for people, making sure I protect Social Security, that I could win over the Republicans I needed. But when it comes to governing, the best example I can tell you is not what happened in the halls of Congress, but on the ball field. You've heard about the Congressional Men's Baseball Team, and they get together.
I'm so glad you're talking about
Now you need to hear this.
Wait, it's a Congressional Men's Baseball team. I played.
No, but
there's a
then there's
women's
the
team.
softball
There's a softball team that women played on. Were you on the men's team?
I was on the baseball team.
Okay, you're on the. There is a men's team where the men, the Republicans, play against the Democrats.
No, that's the team I was on.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But the women had a bipartisan team.
No, we didn't.
The women played.
Bipartisan and bicameral.
Yeah, we had the House, the Senate, Republican women and Democratic women on the same team. We played the media. We bonded together against the media. And we were so intensely competitive. Our average age was 53. The age of all these young women that you see on all the networks was 24, and we beat them because there's no one more competitive than women. But it was Republican and Democratic women pulling together.
They train, it's the whole thing.
At 7
Yeah, it's
a.m.
very
with no
serious.
makeup on. We're out there on the ball fields. Then we had to go to our votes in Congress at 9 o'clock, take a shower. So I know that women are naturally more gifted at pulling together diverse points of view, putting aside your differences, and at the end of the day, walking away as friends. And that's what this country needs more of. Put away that nastiness. We can fight. I will fight to the death on an issue I care about. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to treat you like the enemy just because you disagree. That's the difference when women govern.
The data bears it out, and all the research has shown that, in fact, women on both sides of the aisle, women members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, are not only more bipartisan, they are more productive. They pass more bills. Right. Both Republican and Democratic women elected pass more bills, get more done once they are in office. Donna, to you, and then Melissa, and then we'll open it up.
I would echo all of those things that Kathy said, and the best softball playing together. But the playing together also resulted in doing legislative work together. I mean, some of the best legislative work I did is because of connections I made from our trip to Afghanistan or playing on the softball field, because then you could walk away, you know each other, and you say, can we partner on this piece of legislation or the other? And I think that worked tremendously. I'm not really quite sure how the men do it. I would add to the list of issues, and I share some of those same concerns, is on my to-do list for the last 30 years that I have been working on violence against women. And I remember when we worked first to pass the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, and I was outside of Congress really leading a grassroots effort around the country, and we thought, this will give us a leg up. But even to this day, still 1 in 4 women report that they've experienced domestic violence, sexual assault. And I think that when you're not safe in your home and you're not safe on the streets, it's really hard to then think about your education, your family's needs, all of those things. And I think that this is something that this country we actually have to put all of our energy into trying to figure out this problem of learned behavior. When I was in Congress, I remember I would go around to visit we had several jails and a couple of prisons in Maryland, and I would go around and visit them, and I'd talk with with the inmate population, and almost to a 1, whether it was visiting a men's prison or a women's prison. And I would ask about violence in the home, either that had been witnessed or that they had perpetrated or experienced. And every single time, almost every single hand went up, whether it was men or women who had either experienced domestic violence, had grown up in a home that was violent, or themselves had been perpetrators or victims. This is really a pervasive learned behavior, and it really does hold women back in the workplace. It impacts our economic productivity as a nation, and I think it keeps us from doing the real work of achieving equality and parity in so many levels. And I would put that, sort of, I mean, it's always a long list of issues that you have to work on, but I would certainly put that at the top.
Absolutely, and I think it's part of the reality of where women are today, of where we are in the country, that people don't know and don't appreciate. I have to just say, we're so proud of one of the greatest accomplishments of our work at All In Together is we've trained 900 survivors of domestic violence just in the last 2 years on political and civic leadership, and those women are out in their communities now working to change the laws on behalf of other victims. We need those women to participate and to step up and to help change the status quo, and the work that you've done on their behalf has been so powerful. Melissa, last word to you on this question, and then we'll just open it up for our last few minutes.
In the question again.
Sorry, just what you would like to see is what you think are the most important sort of next steps, investments that we have to make to make sure that we keep progressing in terms of parity for women in this country.
And just real quickly, I think because we're all women sitting up here and have served, we all have been asked to address some of the issues that are more unique to women. And when I was in the state Senate, I was very close to the community of women that ran, they called them domestic violence shelters at the time. And through my learning at the time, a lot of the women I met were economically dependent upon their abuser, which put them in a situation, especially if they had children, where it was really hard to leave. And so I worked together with those heads of those shelters to do 2 things. One is to find a way to provide a place to live that wouldn't be just a temporary shelter. So we actually spawned some, we'd say, apartments kind of that were located in areas that would not be identified, so that the women could live there and be safe while they were partaking of an educational program. And so we had community colleges step up. We had a couple of actual unions step up with their training programs to help these women who couldn't support themselves and their kids, to get them into a program and out of a program quickly so that they were going to earn enough. One of my favorites was a woman who ended up being a forklift operator. She ended up making a really good hourly wage and was able to leave her husband with her 2 children, one of whom was pretty severely disabled. About 2 or 3 years later, he actually murdered his new partner. And it became a big news story, and this woman was willing to speak out about it and said that that would have been her, but for this program that helped her find the strength and the education so that she could actually leave. So when we look at the practical solutions to those problems, some of them are simply, helping that individual get away. Now there's also the other side of it, and I think it was mentioned that, the perps need help too. Anybody who's, if you're in prison, you need some kind of rehabilitation or education to learn that you can't live this way. And so we actually worked also with our local organizations to help, usually men, the perpetrator of domestic violence, to understand and hopefully progress. And we had a lot of success. I mean, you can't say it was 100%, but any change is always good. But I think as we move forward, there's just, I would encourage more women, if you have an interest in this, to run. And I'm a mentor to several. In fact, I was just on the phone with one earlier today. We were talking about it in the green room. A very good friend of mine, she's a state representative now in Pennsylvania. She's running for her 2nd term. And we filed recently. And she now has a man who she defeated in the primary 2 years ago, running to try to unseat her now in the primary. So we're all going to be out there working to make sure he loses big. But I think that's really, I think the mentorship is really important. I think it's important for, you know, it's like I said earlier, just get out there and get involved for everyone. I think the women who are out there and candidates for office, sure, they may be able to marshal a good group of volunteers who are women, because that's, you know, a lot of our friends. And I would encourage the friends of women who are running, don't just leave them out there. One of my very good friends is Heather Heidelbach. She's the Republican nominee, because nobody else is running in the primary, to run for Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania. Heather is probably the most qualified person I think we've ever had run for Attorney General in Pennsylvania. She's been a litigator for 35 years and just really successful, good mom, the whole 9 yards. But she has had this groundswell of women, especially attorneys who she's worked with over the years, come out and work with her to win that seat. So I think that's what it takes. Not to say just support her because she's a woman, but support her because you know she'll do a good job. Exactly.
So I think we have time for a couple questions, maybe one or two before we wrap. We have them on the, I love this. That's so fancy. Okay. Good question. Okay, so do you have any comments about the effects of huge political spending since Citizens United on the progress or advancement of women in elected federal positions, elected office? So the impact of money in politics on women in politics. Kathy?
I have been trying to get campaign finance reform at the national level and state levels since I was a young staffer to Senator Moynihan back in the 80s, because I believe that money is a barrier to women. Because first of all, a lot of women have female friends, but they don't control the pocketbook. They don't have the resources that the men do. Secondly, women are more uncomfortable, I hate to admit this, asking for money to do the fundraising. So this is one of the barriers. And I tell women, the guys don't like it either. Unless you're independently wealthy, like the guy who is worth $65 million who ran against me for Congress, I'm a public servant. I have to fundraise. It's not fun. I'd rather there be public financing, like we just instituted in the state of New York, which is going to be in effect not in very short order following the New York City model, where you raise small donor amounts to a certain threshold. We will match that for you to take the big money out of politics, because it is unseemly, it has undue influence, it is wrong, and Citizens United will go down in history as being one of the worst decisions with respect to protecting our democracy that this country has ever seen. So it's a barrier for women.
Anyone else want to, Donna, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I have to tell you, so the very first debate that I ever did on national television, I was in my mid-20s, and it was against Mitch McConnell about the need for campaign finance reform and public financing of elections. I won that night on Nightline, Ted Koppel.
There you go.
However, we still don't have it. And when Citizens United, the decision was made in the Supreme Court, I introduced the first constitutional amendment to repeal Citizens United. And I remember when I did that, I had three co-sponsors, right? And you all know you don't get anything passed with 3 co-sponsors.
Even with 100 sometimes.
Right. And today, this is however many years later, 8 years, 10 years later. And now virtually every Democrat in the House has signed off on a constitutional amendment. And 2 Republicans, and I think passed in HR, the idea passed in HR 1. And so that's kind of a sea change from 3 to where we are now. And I think the public is well down the line. The public doesn't like this idea of all of this money sort of governing our political discourse. And for women, the system is so debilitating, because it is, first of all, it's what keeps women out. Sometimes the political apparatus and leadership will make a decision before even knowing anything else, that if a woman's name comes forward, it's immediately dismissed because it's presumed that she won't be able to put together the resources to run for office. I certainly saw that when I was the co-chair of the vice chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, is that names would come forward of totally capable women and immediately dismissed because of money. And I think for Republican women, especially Republican women who are running in primaries, that becomes a delimiter for women to be able to get through a primary process. And I've heard, I've had Republican women tell me that, they've been, kind of closed out of that primary process, and it's been around the issue of money. And so we really have to change the system. Right now, first of all, the number of millionaires there are in the Congress has gone so far. The worst day for me was always the day when they published your net worth. In the, because all the newspapers pick up on it. And I was always, in my delegation, I was always, the poorest. In the Congress, I was always in the bottom group. And then they would broadcast it, sort of everywhere. But I think that we have to have a system where, if you're a mom who's been, raising her kids and, organizing in a community and you're not wealthy, that you should be able to run for elective office, and money shouldn't be a barrier to that.
My town of 30,000 people in New York, our race cost $190,000 to win in a town of 30,000 people. Yeah. Right? And that just gives you an idea. It's a New York suburb, but that is what these races are like. This is a local, part-time elected job. A standard congressional seat now is a minimum of $2 million.
Oh yeah, especially if it's a competitive seat. Yeah. I think it's like $4 million.
It's $2 to $4 million. I mean, the numbers are just so incredibly off the charts. So the last question before we wrap. Oh wait, sorry, please.
So I
Melissa.
come to this with a different point of view, and I think it's important to hear
Okay,
because
please.
I am shocked at what you said about Republican women feeling shut out in a primary. I just referred to my friend who has a man running against her. And we all laughed because we know she'll crush him in the primary. Now she's an incumbent, but she also defeated him last time when there wasn't an incumbent. So I would disagree. I think women in a lot of ways have an advantage when they're up against a man. I have another friend who's running to replace a retiring state representative. There's 2 men and a woman running in the primary. Now, she's the only one with any elected experience. She's been a school director on the school board now for 10 years, and she's running for the state house seat. Now, I think she has an advantage. She's the only woman on the ballot. There's 2 men, and I know that a lot of people know her because she's been active in the community. The guys may be able to raise more money, but she already has people. She has people, and don't forget that. I think that money's important, but it's not the thing that wins elections. It's the votes. Money can't vote. And the other issue about women, I'm not for public financing, so we're going to just disagree there. But I think one of the important things about it, and I think why women are sometimes, and I agree, put at a disadvantage when it comes to fundraising, are because it's the men who are writing the checks. If the women would step up and write checks, we'd be a lot better off. And so that's what actually I'm shaming my friends now into helping my friend Heather in her attorney general race, because I'll say, did you write her a check? You don't have to write her a $2,000 check. Write her a $200 check. But you have to help her because once you write that check, you're committed to that race. It's important to you that that person be elected, and you'll put more effort in as well. And I think it's important to have the public support people in that way, and that's why I'm not for public financing, because to be honest, I think that we'd be spending a lot of money on people who really haven't built up that support the way they should before anyone hands them $1 to run a race.
I think it comes down to which election you're running for. I had $7 million of shadowy money that was allowed after Citizens United to destroy my reputation.
No, I'm with you there.
And so, if I was running for town board and I'm asking for $20 checks, and I asked my neighbors to do a barbecue in the backyard, and yes, it is so grassroots, and I'm all about the farm team, starting people out in those levels, and not just paying your dues, but getting the knowledge and the experience so you are the best qualified to run for Congress someday. Yeah. So I'm a believer in the process, although there's certainly exceptions, but I had such negative ads run against me by the Koch brothers and Karl Rove. They were so bad, I didn't want to vote for myself. I said,
Right,
I
that's the
didn't
same
know I was
issue.
that bad. I didn't know I could fly on a broom that well, because they had wonderful pictures of me on a broom. And the little
They
girl
really
next
did,
door
right?
said, you know, Mommy, please turn off the TV. They make Mrs. Hochul look so scary all the time. So that's what's happened with the presence of money because of Citizens United. I'm all
I
about getting
agree.
rid of that.
Yeah.
From those groups. Now, if
Right.
every candidate collects contributions from individuals,
Yep.
I'm good with that. I had $1 million dropped in my race 2 weeks before the election in negative ads from MoveOn.org, and that's how I
Yeah.
ended up losing.
All right, so 30 seconds each of you, lightning round before we close, because I am committed to on-time
Lightning?
departure. I'm committed to that. It's my core value, on time. 30 seconds, 100 years from now. What are we talking about 100 years from now? The 200th anniversary of suffrage. What have we achieved? 30 seconds, and go, Kathy Hochul.
They're going to talk about how in 2020, everything changed. We had 6 women on the debate stage running for president. That is a game-changing photo that's in my mind, and all the young women out there who now think that's normal. So we're going to go light years ahead, starting with this year. I'm a believer that people see the value of women, and we're going to take back this country with the power of women in the Senate, in the House, and our state houses.
Okay, 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Melissa.
Oh, in 100 years, I think the men are going to they're going to start having forums like this and kind of be worried about getting back into elective office.
100 years, Donna Edwards.
Okay, 100 years. Oh, pray goodness, we're going to have a woman president in 100 years.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our amazing panel, Donna Edwards, Melissa Hart, and Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul.
It was a lot of fun to be with you.
Where's the fist bump?
That's right.